Hello, mates. Welcome back to the podcast. And for those who are watching this on YouTube, forgive me for my really unkempt look. It's just I'm up away in the north of Sweden for the month, and I've already been away for a couple of weeks, and I forgot to bring my shaving stuff. So the beard and everything is sort of out of control. But nonetheless, it suits me better that this is an audio medium. Anyway, my guest on the episode today is the author of more than 10 books, host of the History Unplugged podcast, which, by the way, has over 10 million downloads, an entrepreneur and expert on the Ottoman Empire and Turkey. He writes under the name of Michael Rank, but goes by the name of Scott Rank. I came across Scott recently because I became fascinated by Marco Polo. I was searching on Audible for a Marco Polo biography, which I was shocked to find didn't really exist, at least in the markets that I have access to through my Audible subscription. I'm sure there's got to be loads of other Marco Polo biographies. But nonetheless, I instead downloaded this book that caught my eye. It was called Off the Edge of the Map, which listed the 10 greatest explorers of all time. The book is unreal. It's super inspiring and exciting. And if you have some version of Wanderlust, then you will get loads out of this book. My conversation with Scott was divided into 3 very distinct parts. They don't overlap with each other at all. In the beginning, we speak about Turkey and Scott's extensive experience in this country. After all, he lived there for a number of years as an expert on the culture and history, speaks the language, worked as a journalist there, and has held several jobs in the country. We then speak in the middle about the future of content creation and the idea of the personal brand, self-publishing, distributed media, things in line with that line of theme. And by far my favorite part of the chat, the final chat, is where Scott tackles some hyperbolic questions of history. All the timestamps are in the description, so you can navigate through the chat, and I'm in retrospect thinking that I should have perhaps asked him more specifics about the explorers. But again, I try to avoid asking questions of the author's work or books that makes the actual consumption of those books completely redundant, because we very easily, Scott and I, could have just romanticized the 10 explorers from the book, but then you as the consumer wouldn't have much of an incentive to go out and buy that separately, right? So instead, what I at least try to do is find a balance between satisfying my own curiosities about the person, as well as tease and hopefully generate excitement about what they are working on themselves. I hope that makes sense. Just because I really like the way that Tim Ferriss speaks about his sort of podcasting philosophy, where he simply wants to scratch his own itch. And so just bear that in mind as something that is a strong motivator for me. What I want to do when I speak to the guests on this podcast is really scratch the itch of my own curiosities. And those curiosities change before and after you've consumed someone's work. So if you hadn't read the book of the 10 greatest explorers and adventurers on history, the natural questions would be, well, tell me about some of these explorers. Okay, where did they come from? What age did they come from? Where did they travel to? What did they see? What are some of the interesting insights they might have had? And that would make up a really fun interview. There's no doubt about it. But once you've already written the book, me as the host of this podcast don't really want to ask questions to which the answers are such low-hanging fruit that a simple, casual perusal of the book would be able to answer. Instead, hopefully, what I want to do is ask questions that hopefully the guests haven't necessarily had put to them before. That's at least the ambition. That's something that I am putting a lot of effort into trying to achieve. So I hope that motivation has sort of shone through, and I hope that you guys instinctually picked up on that anyway, because my ambition is to corner the podcast market for eclectic curiosities in whatever country it is that you are listening in from. Central to this happening is me to continue to draw in a range of guests that match my own interests as they ebb and flow, and then hopefully conduct interviews with them that they would not necessarily get anywhere else. And I know that's a really high benchmark to set, but that really is what I have in mind for the great majority of the interviews. I want to make sure that the set of questions that they're going to experience are not only a little bit different, but totally unlike the questions that they're likely to get anywhere else, without getting ridiculous. Like, you still need to speak with them within their realm of competencies, more or less, you would think. But my appeal to you here is to just help me achieve this ambition, because discoverability within the podcast algorithms are really in the Stone Age. There is actually only one variable that matters, and that is the amount of 5-star reviews with a comment attached that a podcast has. That's how the directories get to index them and then promote them within their searchability function. So if you're keen as a bean and okay with supporting me, then do share this with a mate and pump your good juice into the algorithm. Pump via 5 stars attached with a review. I really cannot overstate how helpful that would be to me. And that's all from me. Hang around to the end to hear the afterthoughts, and with no further delay, here is the absolutely brilliant Scott Rank. Mr. Rank, Scott Rank, thank you so much for joining me, mate. It's a thrill, really. I absolutely loved your book on the top 10 explorers of all time.
Thank you for having me.
And something that became apparent to me as I was doing the research was just how much more there was to you than simply, the author of a couple of great historical books. And that really informs my opening question, which I will say in a moment. But I'm just saying as well, hopefully, I want to divide this chat into like 3 distinct chapters if possible. Your life in Turkey, some of the geopolitics of Turkey, if we can do that. Your idea of the sort of personal brand going into the future, because it seems like that's actually something you have been thinking about for a long time as well. And then finally, like just fun hyperbolic questions of history. And so hopefully we managed to get through all of it.
All right. Sounds good.
Nice. Well, with that, let's rock and roll, Scott. So much of your life has been lived in Turkey. You became an expert on their history. You learned to speak their language, and you seemingly became a Turk of sorts yourself. You worked there as well. Where did this motivation to escape to a whole nother world from America come from?
It wasn't anything terribly elaborate. In my second year at university, I sound very European when I say that,
Yeah.
Or college to American listeners, I simply wanted to do a study abroad. And a lot of people just sort of fall into Spain or Italy and end up spending 6 months drinking with other Americans. And I just thought, well, I'll go somewhere. And I had some friends who went to Turkey, so I suppose I'll give that a try and go there. So this was in 2002. And I arrived in Turkey. It was about 6 months after September 11th. Some of my family were a little bit confused about, okay, what does this mean? Is this dangerous at all? And I thought, well, I'm no geopolitical expert as a 20-year-old, but whatever the hotspots are in the world, it's about 4,000 or 5,000 miles away from any of that.
Mm-hmm.
So it's kind of like hearing about a terrorist attack in London and being worried about your relatives in Ukraine. It's a very different place. So mentally lumping these in together is a little bit off. Yeah, so I was just an American there, and in Turkey, and I became very intrigued. There's a lot of stock cliches about people who go to that country for the first time. That, oh wow, it's where East meets West. It's all these like cliches that you would see in Frommer's guides and Let's Go Turkey and whatnot.
Yeah.
I was just really intrigued that it was the capital of the Byzantine Empire for 1,000 years, and the largest cathedral in Christendom was there until the Hagia Sophia was outsized by St. Peter's Basilica, but then became the seat of the Ottoman Empire, which was the preeminent Muslim power from about the 1500s up until its collapse following World War I. So there's just, I really didn't have a mental space to understand the categories of society from the United States. I mean, it was simply categorically different. So I had to sort of rewire how I understood society and culture and everything else. And that's really what kicked it off. So it wasn't anything that I really read. It was something that I experienced there. And then after I finished college or university, then I was a journalist there for a few years. Saw that career-wise was a dead end. I became interested in history and then did my graduate degrees there. So that was part of that was kind of the beginning of a very long path to ultimately what led me to where I am now. So now I am going along the history route, and it's studying Turkey and its strange amalgamation of Eastern and Western culture, and it's Islamic, but it also it's a secular republic. So understanding the differences, the so-called contradictions, even though they're not really contradictions, and trying to make sense of it all is sort of what piqued my interest.
Why did you see journalism as a dead end?
I think it's just sort of it's a career path that there will always be a need for it. Sort of like university education. We always have an ongoing need for information about what is the up to moment news happening in politics and society. But it's also a career field that was, I suppose, like forged by baby boomers, as higher education is too. And it became calcified in a certain mold that wasn't really flexible enough to allow people in the next generation to enter and climb a clear career path in a meaningful way.
Mm-hmm.
So it's sort of like a drawbridge career where people, 50 to 70 older sort of got in and made it comfortable for themselves and sort of raised the drawbridge and didn't create meaningful career paths for people in sort of the next rung on the ladder to go up. Um, and the economics of it changed so fundamentally by the internet that the industry at large hasn't. It's adapting, but it hasn't been able to adapt in a healthy, organic way. So, with the convulsions of that industry, it was very hard to be able to climb up that. So, much as similar to the challenges that I faced in higher education, where being able to get a tenure track job, whether in Europe or the United States, is extraordinarily difficult. So there will always be a need for higher education, but the industry itself hasn't really been able to adapt in a nimble way to the realities of the 21st century. So it's still stuck in like a 19th century Prussian model of education when it was first created. So it's kind of goofy.
Yeah, interesting. I think that informs a little bit your personality and the future work that you went into, like recognizing journalism as a place to be because of the business model rather than the love of journalism, the passion of writing and telling stories and so forth, like which was the motivator that you pulled at. But it seems to me that in journalism, it's only a good path if you're sort of at the tail end of exceptional journalists, because they're the ones who can pick up a story, then turn that into a book, and then turn that into a big sort of personal brand and profile of themselves, which sort of informs what we're going to be speaking about later. A guy like Bradley Hope, who wrote Billion Dollar Whale, Blood and Oil, he's now got Project Brazen going. This is an exceptional journalist, and he can therefore sort of leverage that into a great career that has that can be very financially lucrative, but also satisfactory as well, because you are the person with the connections and so forth. But to get into it, I imagine it's just super risky and, it's just a high risk occupation. And I suppose it's funny though that you then went into academia, because people might view that as the opposite end of the risk spectrum. It's almost like a guaranteed work.
Yeah, so not to bore the audience with ranting about my profession and all that, but just to make it, I suppose, useful to listen to if you're not kind of in the space of higher education and how it works. But it's it's interesting. I mean, how the transmitting information and getting people professional certification in our um, information economy is, of course, very necessary, but it's transmitted in a very odd way where we're still largely following a path of the way that knowledge was most effectively transmitted in the 19th and 20th centuries was to have the experts and the research libraries and the laboratories all located in one central location. So that if you're going to study in an advanced way, you would go physically to that place and learn it. With all of the sort of the credentialing and the different and the gatekeeping that has sort of allowed different institutions to control that access of information has still made it necessary, at least in the United States, to take on extraordinary levels of debt to access that information. When in a lot of ways it doesn't make any sense. When hey, we have the internet, we can take online lectures, as the pandemic has shown us. There's no real need for this. So it has made it there's just a lot of for my own personal path, the way I try to, let's say, communicate history. I originally imagined I would be a history professor and wow people's minds by telling stories of the past. And I've taught at universities, but a lot of times it's a class of 20 some students, 16 of which are just there because it's a requirement.
Mm-hmm.
2 of them are really into it, and the other 2 are just on their smartphones. Well, actually probably a lot more than that. Whereas, I mean, I suppose what I like about podcasting is that if anyone doesn't like what I have to say, then they just turn it off.
Exactly,
if if they really don't like it, they leave a 1-star nasty review in all cap locks on iTunes. But I don't read 1-star reviews, listeners. I like 3-star reviews because I like constructive criticism. I always want to get better. I don't read 1-star reviews. So, and so the people who are engaging are there because they want to engage.
Mhm.
So I suppose this is the way I'm trying to square the circle of the strange place that the institution of higher education is in, and my interest in history. So I hope I've, managed to go full circle that question in the roundabout way I've discussed all of that.
Yeah, it seems to me that you managed to achieve both by exiting the academia and embracing the infinite distribution of the internet. You managed to create a history podcast where you get to talk about, write about, and produce content on what you love, and then it also be extremely successful and have 10,000x the distribution that you would have had otherwise if you'd just been in a university campus. It's amazing. It informs the broken business model of traditional academia. But that is definitely not what I want to talk about because you can beat that dead horse for days. Before I move on, I want, at least before we move on from Turkey, I have a very superficial understanding of this country, and this podcast is largely geopolitical, right? So it's really interesting to hear a guest's opinion, especially when it's informed like yours for having lived there and known the history so well. If you could introduce the country to us, the audience, but then also explain its current geopolitical significance, cultural influence, geographical significance, the cliche East versus West, East West, and its potential power. So I know there's a lot in there, but I just want you to be able to take it where you most are interested. But keep in mind, introduce Turkey to us.
If you like coffee, if you like classical music with Turkish marches with heavy percussion, then you have Turkey to thank for that and the Ottoman Empire to thank for that. If you like yogurt, you have the Ottoman Empire to thank for that. So those are little kind of like fun trivia thought nuggets of the historical influence of the nation state of Turkey on Western civilization, from which I imagine most of your listeners come from. I say that as an entry point because when I was a student and I said to my family from the Midwest in America, I was going to Turkey, they thought, oh, that's very strange. It was just a little geographic oddity. It's out there next to those other Eurasian nations, Georgia, Azerbaijan, that little kind of unknown terra incognita on the map. But really, the 20th century was the low point, I would say, of Turkey in terms of its geopolitical power across the centuries. When Turkey, which Istanbul was the former capital of the Ottoman Empire, was at its height of power, it reached as far west as Hungary. And I lived in Budapest for 2 years, and you can still see some ruins of Turkish tombs and their influence on that region. Controlled North Africa. The Mediterranean was largely controlled by the Ottomans. All of the holy sites of Islam, Mecca, Medina, the entire Arabian Peninsula, including Saudi Arabia, up to the borders of Iran. And during the Age of Discovery, there were fleets that were sent out to Indonesia. So you can see their archaeological remains in Indonesia today. They had far-reaching influence. The Sultan was the de facto leader of the Muslim world. And due to over the centuries, as its power waned and the powers of different Western European states rose for reasons I won't get into, it collapsed in World War One. The one general named Mustafa Kemal, who won the Battle of Gallipoli, which is really the only major Ottoman victory of World War One against a strapping young man named Winston Churchill.
Against the Australians. We were the major loser on that day.
Right. So, which, I mean, I have a whole series on World War One if listeners want to listen to, and I give due recognition to how the national character of Australia and New Zealand, the Anzac forces, were really forged in the battles of Gallipoli.
Yeah.
But I don't want to get caught on rabbit trails. So Mustafa Kemal successfully fought the Turkish War of Independence. He is perhaps one of the most dynamic reformers in all of the 20th century. There's a biography of him by Patrick Kinross, which, if you don't care about Turkey, it's a fascinating character study. If you're an executive MBA in change management, if you're studying international relations, Mustafa Kemal Ataturk is an incredible person to study. The Ottoman Empire was Legally, a mixture of Islamic law and Western civil law. He almost completely expunged any trace elements of Islamic law when the Turkish Republic was founded in 1923. He had the Turkish alphabet changed from Arabic letters to Latin characters in the space of about 6 months. So the reading public became functionally illiterate. Now, only 20% of the population was literate, so I guess that's easy to start with. Um, he gave women the right, yeah, he gave women the right to vote. The world he created equality in the law between men and women. The world's first female fighter pilot is Turkish, Sabiha Gökçen, of which there is an airport named after her in Istanbul. It's centuries of change in a short amount of time. Now, Ottoman historians will be upset that I'm saying all this because they'll say, well, what about all the Western democratic reforms that you're not referring to? Listeners, give me the benefit of the doubt. I don't want to, get too far out into the weeds here, but in the United States, when we think about founding fathers, we imagine George Washington as our great military leader. I suppose the legal scholar could be Thomas Jefferson or John Adams. The person who really gave us our maybe folksy character would be Benjamin Franklin. Mustafa Kemal Ataturk is all of those wrapped into one. And one of my professors who grew up in the Soviet Union said, wow, there's more pictures of Ataturk in Turkey than pictures of Stalin and Lenin at Soviet marches. Wow. I remember growing up. It's crazy. So he really infused a secular character in Turkey. If you like alcohol, you can have more access to it in Turkey than most Muslim countries. Mm-hmm. But by no means but a lot of his cultural revolution was very much among the nation's elites. In the hinterlands of Anatolia, it still remained very religious, but many of those people were simply locked out of power and in democratic politics for decades. So with Recep Tayyip Erdogan and the Justice and Development Party, you can criticize him all day long, and I have done it, and I have a lot to say about him that I really don't like about him. But to approach him as neutrally as possible, I think what he has done is integrate and give voice to people who were always there in the Turkish Republic. But I think maybe a lot of Westerners missed out on that. There really was a very religious, and I use this in the most neutral term possible, patriarchal society, mm-hmm. Where the way that society approaches things from really the dynamic of the family in a rural setting is much more of a family clan, father-directed approach to civil and social issues. And they were simply ignored and locked out of power for decades in the Turkish Republic. And now many of these people are being given a voice. And for Western observers, they might think, oh, what's going on? I mean, is Turkey reverting radically back to, is this an Islamic revolution moment or Iranian revolution like we're seeing in 1979? Well, I mean, you can argue that. I mean, many have said that the type of dress is much more religious in Turkey than it was in decades past. But you could also say that maybe people are sort of allowed to express themselves in a way that they were forced to enter a mold that they weren't necessarily comfortable with, and then they don't necessarily need to do that. So maybe the pendulum is swinging one way or another, but these are some of the internal tensions that Turkey is sorting out for itself that as it enters into the 21st century and continues to survive, and some would say thrive.
Yeah, fascinating. You'll see at the end, but I ask a question about which country you're most bullish on, and you'd be happy to know that 2 people have so far answered in favor of Turkey, and only 1 pushed back on it. But let's look at Turkey more today then, because clearly the Ottoman Empire was extremely influential at shaping not only Turkey's modern day culture, but also a lot of the neighboring cultures around it as well. So, but just to give the audience a flavor, it's about 90 million people, I think, bordering Georgia, Azerbaijan, Iran, Iraq, Syria to the east, and then just Bulgaria to the west. And it has obviously Istanbul, which is historically an extremely, what's the right word? Not continental, an extremely multicultural, I don't know, an extremely flavorful city, right? Because it sort of did caricaturally bridge the east and the west, but a lot of trade inevitably had to go through there, stuff like this. So with that very superficial geographic explanation, the population, its borders, your explanation you just gave about its history,
what are the big geopolitical considerations for us about Turkey today? Obviously, Erdogan is a very divisive figure, but even if we go further from Erdogan, what is Turkey's interest right now?
Okay, and I openly give a caveat to your listeners that I'm not an expert in geopolitics, and my existence in Istanbul was not at the heights of its city culture where I wined and dined at diplomacy parties. Listen, dear listeners, for years I was a lowly English teacher scrub who, drank cheap beer. And if you've traveled abroad, if you've ever met American English teachers, the good news is, I mean, if you have a pulse and are American, you can get a job anywhere as an English teacher. You sort of subsist in kind of like the lower crust of the expat world. So, yes, I have my fancy pants degrees, but so I've read some different things, but I've also existed at that strata. So I don't want to be like the barfly who's saying, "Let me tell you how it is," and I'm giving the definitive answer on things. So I openly welcome that I am others who have contradicted me on the show. They very well have a viewpoint that is different from mine, and there's nothing wrong about it, and they could very well trump my knowledge. Having caveat emptored, Turkey has it has incredible structural advantages, of which you just mentioned that it will always be significant, if no other reason than simply for its geography. That Napoleon once said that if there were a capital of the world, it would be Constantinople. Istanbul is on the Bosphorus Straits. To the north of it is the Black Sea. To the south of it is the Sea of Marmara, which enters the Aegean, which enters the Mediterranean, which enters the Atlantic Ocean. So for no other reason than its geography, it was welcomed into the NATO alliance in 1950 because it could form a chokehold on Soviet submarines going back and forth under the Bosphorus Straits. For the east and west reason, there have been numerous pipelines that have been constructed that if there are oil fields in Azerbaijan that or natural gas from Ukraine that wanted to go from there to Europe to bypass Russia, that was another option as well. So for no other reason than geography, Turkey has been and will always remain highly important geopolitically strategic.
They've
Now
been dealt
the
a very
NATO
big
alliance,
geographic hand.
yeah. So I mean, in one sense, you can't screw that up. Another way, they're blessed by not really having that much oil. In the southeastern region, sort of near Iraq and Syria, there is some, but nothing compared to the Arabian Peninsula. What that means is that you haven't had the kleptocracy that you've seen in those nations in Saudi Arabia. So they've had to diversify their economy and construct a knowledge economy. When I lived there, and I've been out of Turkey for a few years now, but I've spent well over a decade in the Recep Tayyip Erdogan era. He's really become a victim of his own success. And for the first, I would say, decade of Erdogan, of the Justice and Development Party, you was, I don't know if I want to say a golden age in Turkey, but participatory democracy open to new people. I mean, he had a vested interest in allowing conservative Muslim voices in because that was his own personal preference in the base of his party. Women who wore headscarves were allowed to participate, and they could wear headscarves working as civil servants in a way that wasn't possible. Women could wear headscarves on public university campuses, which they couldn't until the early 2000s. But even religious minorities, Christians and Jews, were sort of welcome into the fold, and were always given official recognition in the Turkish Republic, but in a way openly embraced. And there was talk just that civil rights for religious minorities. Kurdish people could have cultural festivals using the Kurdish language, of which Kurds were sort of like hammered into this Turkish ethnic mold for much of the 20th century. Things of after the military coup in 2016, I mean, there's really been an aggressive purge where universities were closed down. People who were considered sympathetic to Fethullah Gulen, who's a religious cleric who led this civil organization, this kind of like religious entrepreneurial movement, the Gulenist movement. It's called a number of different things. Who was first seen as an ally to Erdogan, but now is seen as an arch enemy who is trying to overthrow him. Tens of thousands of people who were seen as sympathetic to him were jailed. So there's been numerous purges over time. Erdogan, in terms of his mental health, he seems to be going down the Muammar Gaddafi path, where when you're in power too long, you seem to fall prey to, I don't know, elements of narcissistic personality disorder, where
How could you not?
right, where everyone around you, when you're surrounded by yes men, Muammar Gaddafi's don't happen overnight. Fidel Castro's who give 5-hour speeches don't happen overnight. So now he seems to be waging war against economics itself, where I'm going to cut interest rates. I'm going to keep interest rates low, but inflation will always also stay low because reasons. I don't know. So that's, I mean, he's just the Brezhnevs, the different sorts of oligarchs who are in power for so long that they were really losing touch with reality. I hope he's removed from power in the next few years. I mean, if he were in power for another 10 years, then this is the Turkmenbashi of Turkmenistan who has the rotating statue of himself that always faces the sun. I don't know if we're going to get in that territory, but it could get a little bit weird pretty fast.
Fascinating, Scott. Thank you for that. Now, you first published your podcast in 2017 in May, and I'd really love to get into sort of the minutiae of podcasting with you, but that I think would be too self-indulgent on my end. So for the sake of time, I won't necessarily do it. I'll instead use your foresight into the podcasting world as a way to inform the bigger question that I want to ask, which is, you advocate self-publishing. You were early on podcasts. You write under a pseudonym, right? So it sort of is a protection of identity of sorts, although no, here we are, so you kind of dox, but nonetheless. And you also promote academics with your scholarpreneur venture, right? So this seems to me a premonition of the current and coming future of the self-sustaining, decentralized creator / brand. I'm not sure if you're familiar with Naval Ravikant, Balaji Srinivasan, or these futurist types. They speak about it a lot. But with that as the context, how do you see the future as people, as brands going forward, the individuals who manage to leverage their audience into all kinds of different ventures, independent of traditional distribution and middlemen?
Right. I mean, this is the great opportunity. And this was before my current podcast, History Unplugged, I did a venture for a while called Scholarpreneur, which isn't currently active, but the idea was that if you have a master's degree or a doctorate in the humanities and you can't get a full-time job, which is about 80% of them.
Wow.
And in the United States, 50% of all tenure track history jobs, professorships go to graduates of Harvard. So it's very difficult to break in. Compared to our brothers and sisters in the sciences, where if you have an advanced degree, you don't have to teach at a university. You can go into industry. You can, work for whatever multinational conglomerate. So there's an industry path there. I would argue that there is an industry path as well in the humanities, except you have to be much more creative and forge your own path. This could take what I've done working on podcasting and developing an audience enough that you can have a big enough listenership that you can make the argument, you can have advertising dollars come in. That's one path that can be a little bit difficult. There's a self-publishing path as well. There's nothing stopping you from self-publishing and building an audience. One friend of mine who is taught philosophy at universities for a long time has a patron-funded program called Half Hour Heidegger, who is going through the philosopher Heidegger paragraph by paragraph on the phenomenology of the spirit, which is a super dense text. And master's students of philosophy have to read it. They don't understand it. So they subscribe to his show and they listen to him talk about it. So he'll mention a paragraph and then he'll just get into it. So he's a patron-funded philosopher. And so it's really, I mean, it's kind of the sky's the limit. And there's another friend of mine. He looks at his approach was basically to get an IT job that was very easy, that he got a full-time salary, but it took about 10 hours of work a week. So he looked at full-time employment, and I'm not advocating this, listeners. So don't, I mean, hey, I'll just put the facts out there and you choose what you choose.
Yeah. If you can pull it off.
But I think he read, that I think it was Spinoza had some kind of like low-level bureaucratic job that paid his, it met his needs, but it required very little effort of him. And he was able to work on his treatises that way. So he looked at that as a sinecure. And the traditional idea of a sinecure is maybe you're given a land grant or tax collecting rights from a king. So you have an avenue to produce wealth for yourself, but it requires very little time and effort on your
Mm-hmm.
part.
Mm-hmm.
So my friend, he just looks at his low level IT job as a sinecure, and he's able to do his other things on the side. So I thought, all right, I mean, in our remote work world, that's a very creative approach to it. If he can avoid his employer hearing about it, I don't know. That's one way to look
That's
at it.
brilliant. I mean, it's brilliant. You mentioned this. Was it Schopenhauer text, the deep or Heidegger, a deep Heidegger text? This man who's running this podcast or text here.
Yeah, I forget which one.
Are you familiar with the Talkcast, which is sort of does a similar thing with David Deutsch's work?
I am not, but it
Okay.
sounds like they're on the similar path.
It's unbelievable. It's such a great story of serendipity, which informs so much the premonition that you saw by getting early on this so long ago, and what everyone else is really coming to see now. The value of creating that personal brand ish. This guy's an Australian. He was a philosophy teacher, an academic, not at a fancy university by any means. I can't remember. It might have been Western Sydney, but I might be wrong by saying that. And he started, he's fascinated by David Deutsch. He doesn't have to pretend to put any effort into it. He would be doing this if he wasn't getting paid anyway. And he goes exceptionally deep with, hour-long episodes on a paragraph of a text, right? Fascinating stuff. And it was so good. One of his audience fans was a guy called Naval Ravikant, who is a very well-known name in the sort of tech entrepreneurial space and venture capitalist space. And now he collaborates with him. And that's amazing. That's this beautiful moment of serendipity that is created by the functionally infinite distribution of the internet. The fact that, you yourself with History Unplugged, I read it was about 10 million downloads, and that seemed like a web page that hadn't been updated in a while. I'm sure it's a lot more now. That's a type of reach that even if you were the greatest history teacher of all time, you never could have taught that many students, right? It's an amazing thing. So how can we think about this further? That's really what I wanted to speak to you about, because you seem to have done it in 3 different distinct fields: podcasting, self-publishing, and then the scholarpreneur. What about, let's look at publishing. Traditionally, you would have zero distribution without a publisher. I'm still kind of skeptical of how much distribution you can have as a self-published person without a big audience. Can you speak to this at all, and maybe enlighten us a little bit about that?
Yeah, absolutely. And I've done both. I've been traditionally published, and I've done self-publishing. And there's a lot of great resources out there. For years, I listened to this podcast called the Self-Publishing Podcast. I don't know if it's still active or not, but that gave me great raw material, because there were 3 guys who hosted it, and they just gave all of their tactics and talked about what worked and what didn't. So the traditional publishing, self-publishing and traditional publishing each have their strengths and weaknesses. Up until maybe 10 years ago ish, if you were a self-publisher, that was for flat earth conspiracy theorists, lizard people. That's sort of like, that was the world of self-publishing.
Sure.
You are a dissident thinker. So, and if that's your scene, then whatever. But now, I mean, with the tools that Amazon has had, it became very easy to do. And what a lot of people early on realize is that the royalties I can get from traditional publishing is maybe 10 to 20% approximately. With self-publishing, it's about 70%. And now you have to do all of your own promotion, but the way that the traditional publishing industry has lost so much money, they don't really do that much promotion for you anyway. They are typically looking for authors who already have a large platform who can promote it.
It's such a bad case of survivorship bias, isn't it?
Right. So yes, if you are a large author, if you are a name, they will promote you, but it really is a tournament model, like journalism, like higher education, where the spoils go to a few people at top, and then the vast majority get very little whatsoever. And the stat is something like 90% of books don't sell more than 5,000 copies, something like that.
More than 90. It's like 95%. And then of the 95%, about 95% again sell less than 1,000 copies.
So there's with self-publishing, if you have your own platform, if you have a podcast, if you have a blog, if you have anything like that, I can vouch that I made far more money self-publishing than I did traditional publishing. Now, self-publishing, the thing is, it's very, very rarely will it be as polished as a traditionally published book. Traditional publishers still have a system of developmental editors who will do a pass. You'll go back and forth between your editor a few rounds. Then they'll have a proofreader or two do multiple passes. So whatever the end product is, even the most middle tier traditional publisher will produce something that, at least in its copy, is almost flawless. I can say, like, having been a few years removed from my self-published books and traditional one, that the self-published, even the ones where I had outside help do rounds of editing, it still doesn't have that final level of polish that a traditionally published book does. And in terms of prestige, there's still more of a cachet that goes with a traditionally published book. So if you don't care about revenue and you just want to be introduced as an author and to be thought of as an author, saying, oh, I am published by Penguin Random House or Simon and Schuster or Doubleday or Cambridge University Press, whoever it is, that will have cachet than simply I wrote a book. Now, the vast majority of people don't know the difference. So if it really strokes your ego enough to say, like, I wrote a book, and you think that will make you a different person, then just write a book and self-publish it. I'll say, listeners, it's a great thing to write a book. It's a miserable process, and you're not fundamentally a different human on the other side of it. So a lot of people talk about, oh, my dream is to write a book, paint a self-portrait, build a log cabin, and all these little bucket list items. Do it. If that's a goal, go ahead and do it. There's nothing stopping you, but you're not fundamentally you're still sort of the same human you were on the other side. So
100%.
Rejoice or despair based on that information. Yeah.
I was trying to maybe more get at the distinction between traditional publishing and self-publishing in terms of distribution. So you say that you made more money self-publishing, but did you sell more copies under the self-published or under the published?
Far more self-published.
Okay. And is that also part of the reason because your first book was through a traditional publisher, and therefore once you have the name recognition, the second one might do, 1,000x the sales the first one did?
I had, I think 10 or 11 self-published books, and then my traditionally published book came after that. And and some of my best sellers were my earlier books.
Interesting.
And a lot
so
of it was just, so it was all like knowing about marketing tactics on Amazon. And one advantage on Amazon is that because you keep 70% of the revenue, at least several years ago, a sweet spot for pricing was $2.99, because you still keep 70% of the revenue, but it's cheap enough that many people would simply purchase it without having to think about it terribly hard. Whereas a traditional publisher, they're focusing on physical copies. And so they don't want to make the ebook cost too different, because then from a positioning standpoint, that would tarnish the physical product. So it might be $15.99 for an ebook. So people simply wouldn't splurge on it the way they would for an ebook. So I had a print on demand company, so I could sell physical copies of my self-published books, but the vast, vast, vast majority of sales were through ebooks.
Yeah. Interesting. So it really, the three domains that you've looked at there, academia, podcasting, and publishing, the internet has completely obliterated those traditional business models, quite clearly. If you can self-publish, if you can write a book, pay a guy a one-time fee to edit it, pay one guy a one-time fee to make the fancy artwork of it, and then just say to your podcast audience, which is hundreds of thousands of people, presumably, hey, I've got a new book out. You'll sell way more than you ever would have if you had partnered with Penguin, the biggest publisher in the world. And that's really exciting, I think, for any sort of person out there who is a type of content creator. But it's also very daunting, because what was predicated on you doing so well is the fact that you had this big audience to leverage it off of. And it makes me think that some of the best books ever written, some of the best essays ever written, they exist right now on empty web pages that no one ever goes to look at, because they haven't managed to build this type of audience. And so you poke your head out for a second of the business model and think, oh, wow, I've actually maybe found the path here. But then you're quickly sucked back into the survivorship bias driven circle where only the big audience guys get the big book. Steven Pinker just released Rationality. I really like Better Angels of Our Nature, but I started listening to this book and I didn't think it was that good. But he's on every big podcast and he's probably going to sell hundreds of thousands of copies of this book. And it's just like, it's guaranteed at this point. Now, here's the tail end example, but there's still so many other guys and girls out there writing great books. I don't know if there's anything worth to comment on that. I mean, I just wanted to sort of, that's my thoughts on it at least.
There's extraordinary possibility, and really, I mean, what I'm happy about with this journey is when I first created an ebook, it was on the tail end of a year of failed online ventures where I entered this world because I was doing my PhD and our first child was on the way, and my wife and I didn't have enough money, so I was teaching English at the time.
Mm-hmm.
And I thought, this was when I was in Budapest and I was physically going from place to place, and thought, I don't have enough time in the day to travel these locations. It's 2010. Is online English teaching a thing? And that started to be a thing with using Skype, and I was teaching students in Japan. Then I thought, okay, I cut out the travel time, so this is better. I'm getting more per hour. I've never had any sort of like business background, but I just like Googled internet business and I discovered Tim Ferriss's 4-Hour Workweek. So I read that and thought, wait, you can just start something online. I know history. I focus on the Ottoman Empire. I had the least marketable knowledge base that anyone could ever have. So some friends and I, we built a website called 5-Minute Courses, where in 5 weeks, in 5 minutes a day, we just like pounded this number 555, learn a subject. Mm-hmm. And so it was these knowledge modules that people could learn things. And no one really went to the website. It didn't turn into anything, but I took my portion, which was focused on history, and I created a podcast called History in 5 Minutes, and people listened to it. It was just 5 minutes long episode on random topics. And then that led to the first ebook I did about a history of the Middle East called From Muhammad to Burj Khalifa. So I thought, if I were explaining to my mother, who's from Iowa, knows nothing about geopolitics, what's up with the situation in the Middle East and Israel and Palestine? How do you explain, somewhere between 50 years and 4,000 years of history? So it was just about 25 chapters, each in 5-minute increments, that came from this 5-minute courses idea. So this failed idea that turned into this kind of successful but not really idea became my first ebook, which I published under a pseudonym because I was terrified that, my academic career is here, but then I'm publishing online. What will my professors think? What will everyone I know think? Because they're definitely online looking at what I'm doing when really they don't care. Nobody cares.
They might not have heard of it anyway.
I published, thought, whoa, I'm actually making money. This is causing a dent in our grocery bill. I should follow up on this. So that's what led to that path. But it was anything you try online, there's almost no financial risk whatsoever. There's almost nothing. I mean, you can make a podcast for $50.
It's a time risk. That's it. And it's not even.
Yeah, that's all it is. I mean, and worse happens. It didn't work, but you learned something that can be transmuted into the next thing.
100%. Yeah.
So listeners, nobody cares what you're doing is, I mean, okay, your fans will care about you, but everyone that you knew growing up, no one is following you online, seeing what you're up to. So try something out. I mean, my professors never followed up on what I was doing online. I think they heard about it here or there. I knew they wouldn't really get it, so I just didn't talk about it. And they were so busy with their own stuff that they didn't mind. So just try it. That's
whatever anxiety you might have over someone realizing that you've created this thing they didn't know about, it goes away the second that their eyes scroll past it. I had this really big anxiety about sharing my podcast episodes on LinkedIn. I never shared them on Facebook or anything. In fact, I even still have this anxiety to not share it on Facebook. But I didn't want people who I'd known through my life who might have had this idea of me as a guy who wasn't going to do anything that special try and put himself out there like that without the validation, because it's not a big famous podcast. It's still an up and coming podcast. And I was very nervous and anxious at times about them seeing it and being able to, ridicule me over it. And recently it started going on LinkedIn, and it's just like the second you see it and their eyes have scrolled past it, it's like, oh yeah, of course they don't give a fuck. Why would they give a fuck? And so, yeah, I just totally second that. And there's a lot more we could say about this as well, but I am very conscious of the time since we've already gone over your allotted amount, and we haven't touched the most exciting, or at least the most fun part of the chat, I think. So
yeah, whatever the fun part of it you think it is, then
okay.
we would be remiss not to crack open that egg, or whatever phrase people use for that.
Okay. So in the book, you listed 10 famous explorers and adventurers. I just wanted to ask if there were 2 or 3 that didn't make the cut that you wish you could have written
about. I think one that doesn't appear. This is like probably one of my favorite people to study. I didn't really mention. I think I just mentioned him in passing because the actual what he added to our sum total of geography and human knowledge wasn't significant, but who he was personally was very significant. That is James Holman.
Okay.
He's a man who traveled about 250,000 miles on foot. He was admiral in the British Navy in the early 1800s. He went to South Africa. He went to the jungles in Brazil, to the Australian outback, and he was also completely blind.
Wow, what a fascinating guy.
Yeah, I mean, he basically taught himself echolocation. So he's like a Daredevil, the Marvel superhero, where he hiked Mount Vesuvius when it was on the verge of a volcanic eruption. He could walk into a crowded restaurant and find his friend on the other end of the restaurant in a noisy environment. So he's someone that there's a book about him called A Sense of the World. It came out about 10 years ago. It's one of my favorite books of all time. I think just in terms of an inspirational figure, the approach that Holman had to any situation whatsoever was, okay, how do I accomplish this particular feat? He wanted to be the first man to hike across or to cross Russia, or not the first man, but the first contemporary European travel writer to go across Russia by land, which he made it 3/4 of the way there in a rickety cart, but only because agents of the Tsar captured him and thought he was a spy and then deported him. But he was going to basically circumnavigate the globe on foot, traveling on modest means. So one of the most resourceful people I've ever read about, just absolutely, he blows me away. So that's somebody I would have included, but his actual geographic discoveries didn't equal, I don't know, Charles Stanley or Captain Cook or someone like that. Or Henry Stanley, sorry.
That is fascinating. What an amazing guy. And that's also, I mean, for me at least, I'm just projecting my own interests maybe far too much here, but that book that you wrote, very short book about the 10 sort of greatest explorers and adventurers in history, few things get me more motivated to sort of tackle the world. Very cliche, but at least get out there and do something significant. Some of the feats that these men underwent is unbelievable. Like this one you've just regaled about, James Holman. I mean, that's itself unbelievable. Do you think there are still great adventures to be had? So obviously there's great adventures to be had, but I should qualify that. Do you think there's great explorations at our fingertips? In 2004, a guy called Tim Cope, an Australian, he traveled on horseback 10,000 kilometers through the Eurasian steppe, and was extremely resourceful in the way he sourced horses, took care of horses, dealt with the drunks, dealt with the savages, everything like this. Savages, I should qualify that. Dealt with the criminals, I suppose. That's an amazing thing to do. In your eyes, do you see right now, 2021, what's a great exploration that one could undertake?
I mean, in some senses, the challenge that an explorer expose himself to is available to all of us, depending on, it could be doing a 6-month caribou hunt in the Arctic. That could be one, or is there a section of your city that you live in where there's a large immigrant community? Could you, I don't know, live with a family there and immerse yourself in, let's say, the Polish language the entire
Mm.
time? I mean, it's something that is literally in your own confines of the challenge. Now, some things have changed irrevocably, and that is the actual discovery that you could make where you're going into completely unknown land and you're doing sounding and creating a depth chart and discovering unknown bird species to report back to the Royal Geographic Society. That type of thing, unless you have highly specialized knowledge, or you're going to the ocean depths in a bathyscaphe,
The
you're
ocean,
probably
yeah.
not doing. But I'm currently doing a podcast series called Age of Discovery 2.0. I've been an enthusiast of NASA and space exploration and dorky golden age sci-fi since I was in middle school. So I'm speaking to uh, different engineers and futurists and other people who've explicitly made the connection from the first age of discovery to the second age of discovery. So Elon Musk has promised to drop the cost of rocket transportation, or what it costs to get something into orbit, by multiple factors. So by within a decade, the cost of getting into orbit or the moon or the Mars, one could say, isn't too dissimilar from the cost of going to the New World in the 1600s. So what did that mean to Europe in terms of its knowledge, in terms of how it changed its economy, opened up new trade routes, the discoveries that it made, what that meant for it technologically. So that's at least one vista that is not available to us today, but could happen in the very near term future. So that's one avenue I'm exploring right now. So if you want to check out History Unplugged, that's what I have going on, and you can see what you think.
Oh, for sure. We're going to drive everyone there. It'll be in the podcast description, links to your books, but also the podcast as well. But it seems to me, yeah, it's the depths of the ocean or the infinite space outside of our atmosphere that could be worth exploring. But to me, isn't the great variable of exploration what you learn with your fellow human?
Yeah.
When the English went through Australia, that's a bad example because it was so horrible. But say when Marco Polo went through Asia, right? The great flavor of his adventure was learning about the Mongols, learning about the Chinese, reporting on these crazy people who apparently walked on their hands in Taiwan. That to me seems like the great romance of the adventure, less so than reporting on the lay of the land, which it seems to me, if you went to the depths of the ocean or outer space, it's not as romantic in my eyes, which is a shame. Like, maybe it's not even possible for us to do, but I do like what you said about the whether you can still find a local exploration, whether it is settling with an immigrant family, trying to see life through the eyes of someone who's led a completely different path to you. That's fascinating. Or the 6-month caribou.
Yeah,
hunt.
one of my greatest memories of Turkey, for every historical building or, I don't know, palace from the Seljuk Empire you could see, all of those things are fantastic. But for about 6 months, when I first moved to the country and my Turkish was a little bit shaky, I lived with a family that spoke no English. That alone was probably by far, I think one of the most meaningful experiences. It was exceptionally challenging, but feeling like you're completely immersed in a different world. What do they do socially in the evening? What do they watch? What are dinner customs? All those different things. I mean, that's sort of, in that sense of discovery, was something big.
So in your list of explorers, they were exclusively European, Arabic, or Chinese. And that's just, I think, a consequence of the record keeping of these civilizations at the time. I was wondering, in your research, if you came across some ancient Egyptian who traveled up to Scandinavia, or some sort of some sort of Aztec explorer who went up and dealt with the Native Americans. Was there any other great civilization connections apart from just Asians and Europeans sort of checking each other out?
Yeah, people love that, and I love that too. Finding people in places we don't expect them to be. And you're right, it's a problem with record keeping, where William of Rubric, who went to the court of the Mongolian Empire before Genghis Khan or before Marco Polo, found that there were many Europeans who were there. Now, a lot of them were captured when the Mongols came to Europe and took slaves with them. So they were like a giant tidal wave that pulled people in their undertow. But I think in archaeological or excavations of tombs in Japan from the 6th century, they found Roman beadwork that was probably passed over multiple hands on the Silk Road trade route from person to person to person to person. It was just this curiosity and trinket. Could a Roman have ended up in Japan though? We don't know. It's possible. There have been fishermen off the coast of Africa who've been blown into Brazil. There are sites, they're almost certainly fake, of Phoenicians in Brazil as well. I mean, they're almost certainly forgeries, but people inadvertently ending up in the New World or across continents. There's no reason to think it wouldn't have happened with Vikings essentially in longboats hopping from England to Ireland to Shetland Islands to the Faroe Islands to Iceland to Greenland to Newfoundland. These were modest vessels, and people could have been doing this stuff for time immemorial. So, yeah, listener, I mean, we don't know. I mean, it's shocking how much we don't know. We can't know. We're learning little things here and there. Sometimes we make archaeological discoveries. With genetic mapping, we're starting to see large-scale movements of people across centuries that are opening up, giving us really interesting views about how general population movements happened. But yeah, it's could someone from sub-Saharan Africa ended up in Russia? Possibly. No reason why not.
Yeah. What I most wish is someday discovered in some ancient tomb is a document of the life of some ancient Egyptian, who went through Europe, went through Asia, made it back, and commented on the wild people, the wild nature, the wild everything. I think that would just be so amazing, because 3000 BC is just so long ago. And that is, for me, it would be the most amazing find ever. And potentially it was existing in the libraries of Alexandria before it was burnt down. Who knows?
Yeah.
Yeah. I was actually on the weekend at a Viking exhibition here in Stockholm, and they were showing off this big Buddha, which was found at a burial site. And I think they really overplayed the idea that the Vikings made it into China, because I was like, guys, they just stole it from someone who had been to China, right? Like, that's obviously what happened here, that they were trying to make this connection, and it is fascinating. Look, Scott, you've been so generous with your time. So I just got last questions here for you. They're very quick answers. You've written books that compile hyperbolic lists of things, or some books. History's Greatest Explorers, History's Most Insane Rulers, etc. So in that spirit, I wanted to ask you a few hyperbolic questions. And
Excellent.
there is 5 or 6 in total, and we'll just rip them off. History's Greatest Ruler.
Yeah. Thinking about so many different X factors in my brain right now. Julius Caesar. He was both an effective military leader and statesman, and promulgating effective civil law. So I'll choose him.
Amazing. History's most misunderstood figure.
Caligula, the Roman emperor too. So he's in my History's Most Insane Rulers. A lot of people argue that it was if you're typically maligned as insane, a lot of times historical sources are written by people 1 or 2 rulers after you, because they're trying to castigate the previous person as being so terrible that it justifies what it is you did to liquidate him. So a lot of the craziest stories about his incestuous orgies come from historians after him, sometimes several generations after him, who are part of completely different political factions. So there's a good argument made that he was trying to take out the aristocracy, and he failed, so that's why he was impugned.
But it's confirmed that he made his horse a senator, right?
Incitatus, probably not, but the story's so good that it's just really hard to let go of.
Okay.
Yeah.
History's most important figure.
I would say Justinian, the Byzantine emperor, because the Jura Civilis, he compiled and codified Roman law and standardized it throughout his empire. And that's still the basis of Western canon law, which has influenced much of the rest of the world. So I would, for legal reasons, that's why I would say him.
Fascinating. I'd never heard of him. Um, History's most fascinating civilization.
Oh man, this is really straining my brain muscles. A lot of times in this, it's best just to say something, even sort of like the first thing that comes to your mind. I'm thinking back when I was a member of Toastmasters and you have to give an impromptu speech and you just say something and you just run with it, even though
Yeah.
it's not really what you think it is. But since I'm on the record here, I don't want to be held to this permanently because I'm going to get what's the French term, like the wit of the stairs after you walk away and you're at the staircase and you think that's what I should have said.
I
I
wish
can
I
already
knew that
see
term. I don't know it.
it's something in French, which I know the translation, but I don't know what the original term is. Most interesting civilization.
Look, it's subject
okay,
to recency bias. You can't help it,
right,
but nonetheless.
exactly. Okay, so I will say the Vikings because far more than not, they really weren't pillagers. Of course, the Vikings pillage. Of course, we have accounts of them going after Irish monasteries and whatnot. And the Book of Kells was like a monk narrowly escaped from it being ransacked. More often than not, they were just traders. So when you gave the example of people having a Buddha, they traveled down the Volga River basin. They were the bodyguard of the Byzantine emperor. If you go to the Hagia Sophia Church in Istanbul, you can see runic script graffiti on the second story of somebody leaving that there. In their gravestones, they have currency from the Abbasid Caliphate because they traded with Arabs. Some of our best accounts of the Vikings come from Arab chroniclers and diplomats meeting them. So their network of exploration and travel is really vast. And they were also the last major civilization, or I don't know if I call them civilization. Yeah, civilization that believed the world was flat because their cosmology of Midgard had that. So no one in the Middle Ages, no educated person thought the world was flat. Go back to Alexandria. The Greeks really determined the circumference of the world 2,300 years ago. No one thought it was flat at all, but many of the Vikings did if they held to the Viking cosmology of Midgard and Asgard and all that. So that's interesting.
For sure. Just the weekend before, I was in a place called Mariefred, which is a very small town about an hour west of Stockholm on a river. Big Viking community back in the day. And they've kept some runestones there standing. And in the translation, one of them was talking about, it was like a dedication to a brother that died on a Russian raid in the Rus. And they called the Russians eagle food. And I was just like, what a great civilization. What a fascinating people, to sort of leave that behind as well. And I guess a lot of the romanticization of the Vikings also comes from their mythology, just being so imaginative and so original. It's amazing. I'm actually going to make a podcast series on the Viking mythology, just as a side, because they have some of the best stories. Okay. 2 more hyperbolics. The greatest place and time to have ever lived in history.
Greatest place and time to have ever lived. I love history. I'm a historian. I think I'm actually taking a line from Bill and Ted's Bogus Journey, where there's no better place to be than here. There's no better time to be than now. When Bill and Ted can travel throughout the cosmos in any time they want to go to. I love history. I love it's fascinating. I think it gives us a lot of, I describe it as a laboratory of human experience. Do you want to do surgery without anesthetic? I mean, I did an episode that a lower income person today is in many ways wealthier than John Rockefeller or a billionaire from 1900. He had an automobile, which the worst, lowest tier vehicle your Russian Lada is better than the most luxurious vehicle he could have had then. There were no anesthesiologists back then. He could have still been stricken with polio or smallpox. There were no vaccinations. I mean, compared to, I did an episode at the beginning of the pandemic talking with an epidemiologist who wrote a book about Spanish flu. And he said in March 2020 that this isn't going to be nearly as bad as Spanish flu. And this was when we didn't know very much at all. But he basically said, we have penicillin. So that's nice. I mean, we have antibiotics. We're not going to die of these different things. But if I had to choose one, I would say being a member of the landed gentry in France in the Middle Ages, not king, I would say a duke, because if you're in cities, there's all sorts of diseases. It's super gross. But if you're in the landed gentry, and if you're a king, rivals are coming after you. If you're a duke, you're wealthy enough to enjoy the spoils of that, to have other people labor on your behalf, and you can enjoy some of the court life that medieval culture has to offer you. But you're probably not going to get attacked by an army as likely. So that's nice.
Nice one. Finally, you did a series called the Presidential Fight Club. If you could expand on that to literally any political leader of history, who wins?
Anyone throughout history who had the greatest martial ability. Without familiarizing myself with a lot of other civilizations, and I'm sure listeners could think of, I know Japanese history, and this person during the shogunate period, this samurai turned looter would be better.
True,
and now I don't know about that. I would say probably Mehmet IV. He was a sultan who was kind of a lazy layabout. He didn't spend much time ruling. He spent more of his time hunting. He was extraordinarily physically powerful. I think he was about 2 meters tall, and
wow.
He could lift people over his head like it was nothing. So now you're in Sweden, so I'm sure some people will charge that. Well, what about Gustavus Adolphus, or what about these other people? But I'm going to go with Mehmet IV. So avid hunter, very strong physical specimen. I'm going to go with him.
Amazing. And just also for the viewer, spoilers, maybe you don't want to say, but who ended up being the American presidential victor?
He's looking over my shoulder. If you can't see him, listeners, and if you're just hearing, he is a president. He is on Mount Rushmore. Teddy Roosevelt. He was a boxer. He knew judo. He, in the 1912 presidential election, was shot in the chest by an attempted assassin, but he knew enough about anatomy. He wasn't coughing blood, so he realized that his lung hadn't been punctured. So then he went on to give a 90-minute speech before he went to the hospital. So that's a tough customer. They don't make presidents like that anymore.
No. Look, Scott, that I think that was unreal. Thank you so much. I just want to close it out with the 2 questions that I leave with all my guests. The first being the country that you are most bullish on.
That I think has the brightest future?
Yeah.
I think... It's really reforming themselves well. Yeah, I'll just go with Turkey. I mean, that fits with our discussion. And
100%, yeah.
I think they're going to be able to make it past the post-Erdogan era and take whatever positive fruits that came from his reign, but then hopefully get rid of all the nepotism and kleptocracy that's crept in the last few years.
Beautiful. That's another one for Turkey. So I think I'm keeping a mental tally in my head. I think that puts Turkey in the top 3 or 4 countries now in terms of number of votes. Finally, this is, I think, a very suitable question for you, someone who has played a lot of hypotheticals with history. If you could witness a conversation between any 2 people, dead or alive, no language barrier, who would they be and why? A podcast, if you could listen to a podcast.
Religious figures, should I do that? Or should I do military figures? Should I do statesmen? Should I do... what I'm trying to do in my mind is think who are 2 different people that I highly respect who came on completely opposite answers to an issue that they were both dealing with, and seeing them argue about the relative merits of what it was they were trying to do. would be an interesting. So that's a vantage point that I'm looking at it from. So I guess since we talked about travelers and explorers a lot here, I'll just have two, just because this is only because it's recency bias and fresh on my mind. We mentioned Hernan Cortes, who conquered Mexico. He was essentially a criminal. He committed treason, a criminal act, just by entering Mexico with the disputes he was having with the governor of Cuba. He had a number of bastard children among local women whom he fathered them with. He used pretty dirty-handed tactics. Hear him talk to Bartolome de las Casas, a priest who wrote about all the different violations of the dignity of the Indian people that were being experienced by the conquistadors to the Spanish crown. So hearing them hash out their very different approaches to the New World. So that's just like from a first pass answer, that's what I would say.
That is a brilliant answer. I'm so happy that you thought about it to come to that, because that would be an unbelievable conversation, actually. Similarly, James Cook against Bartholomew's English counterpart, to hear them reflect on why they decided with destruction, whether that was the obvious, whether enslavement was the obvious route, and if there was any other options, and whether it came from a place of pure racism or whether it came from a place of just a power trade-off. That would be fascinating. So yeah, great answer. Okay. Well, Mr. Rank, again, thank you so much, mate. And I'm going to put links to your copious online ventures to the in the description.
All right. Sounds good. Thank you very much.
Cheers, man.
Well, I really, really appreciated how thoughtful he was with the people he chose for the conversation at the end. The ethics of the explorers back in the day is so often spoken about. Why was subjugation and enforced slavery and theft and pillaging necessary? Why was there not another way that the civilizations could have clashed? And if there was no other way, why did the great explorers, Columbus, Cook, Cortez, what did they think about it? How did they reconcile it? Was it even something that they did think about? Or did they literally just have the idea in their mind that they were two separate types of species? That James Cook had almost nothing in common with the Aboriginals that he met on the shores of Botany Bay. Or Hernan Cortez had absolutely nothing in common with the Aztecs that he met when he touched down in Mexico. To have these questions answered, or at least reflected and pondered upon, would be so magnificent. And also just notice with Scott just how much of history is at the top of his mind to recall from. The hyperbolic questions were absolutely no sweat, yet the answers were no sweat for him, and the answers were considered and thoughtful, and I really, really appreciate that. If you want to hear just how bad the English invasion of Australia was, then listen to episode 35 I recorded with Mike Salbro, an Indigenous man who grew up in Sweden. He will answer the ethical question for you unambiguously. An absolutely amazing man. Finally, that's it, guys. Cheers for sticking around until this point. Leave a big positive review on the podcast. Just swipe up and give it a whirl. I really cannot understate how helpful it would be to me. Plus, Atlas Geographica, that's the website where all the writing is housed on as well. In addition to this podcast, there's tons of articles getting pumped out there. So give it a go. Cheers for listening to the end. You're a legend. Ciao. See ya.